Spoiler, it was one of his lesser wives who wanted her son to become the next king and bump the crown prince.
I would kill my husband if I was the lesser wife.
Well, so, how are you going to estimate your body count? Even though we have some lovely suggestive bits of evidence like graffiti on some of the blocks in the pyramids, which have the names of the gangs that were responsible for the block dragging. So you have names like the Friends of Khufu.
Yeah, there's like nicknames and stuff,
Yeah.
aren't there? Yeah.
Or the Drunkards of Menkaure. I love that.
I want to be in that team.
You're like, it sounds like quite
No, you
good.
don't. You would not build a pyramid with a hangover. That sounds like the
in the
worst.
heat as well. I can see where this is going, but talk to me about the escalation of hands to not a sentence I thought I'd be saying on a public podcast.
But as opposed to your private podcast. Hello and welcome to After Dark. I'm Anthony.
And I'm Maddy.
And today we are talking about the dark history of ancient Egypt. Now, there is a lot to get through in this topic and a lot that we shall discover we've been getting wrong. But to help set the scene, here's Maddy.
He was a farmer once. His mind wanders, remembering the feeling of warm soil between his fingers, the scent of fresh grain after the harvest. The memory is pierced by shouting, heaving, groaning. Now his hands are blistered and cracked. They smell of crushed limestone and blood. At night, under the thin cover of stars in a makeshift encampment, he lies beside other conscripts, farmers who are forced to trade seasons of planting for seasons of pain. During the long days, a misstep here means a crushed limb or a crushed man. No one stops. There's no time. Khufu's vision, the Great Pyramid, must rise. The priests say Khufu is divine, that building the pyramid is a sacred duty. To question it is to question the will of the gods, but he wonders, if the gods are watching, why do they allow this suffering? He's witnessed a friend be crushed to death beneath a block that slipped from the sled. The overseer didn't stop. The sun kept beating down, the pyramid continued to rise. Some nights he thinks of running, but his family is back home. If he flees, they will suffer. So he stays. He hauls the ropes. He bleeds into the stone, knowing the cost he might have to pay. Whilst the unlucky get crushed beneath the monument they'll never live to see completed, their bones will forever be a part of the foundation. This is not just a tomb for a king, it's a graveyard for those that built it.
Well, there you go. That's just a small taste of the grim histories that we'll be exploring today, and probably one you weren't too familiar with. I didn't know some of this. And to help us, of course, is a returning guest to After Dark, and that is Egyptologist Dr. Campbell Price. And Campbell last came on After Dark to talk to us about the untimely deaths and supposed curse that followed the opening of Tutankhamun's tomb after it was sealed shut some 3,000 years ago. Now, Campbell is an Egyptologist at University of Liverpool and curator of Egypt and Sudan at the Manchester Museum, University of Manchester, which of course has one of the UK's most significant Egyptology collections. After that lengthy introduction, Campbell, you are very welcome back to After Dark.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be back on After Dark.
We have an upfront question which actually comes via my nephew Danny, who is obsessed, as I was saying to you before we started recording.
Shout out to Danny.
There's Danny
Hi,
getting all his shout outs on After Dark. What time are we talking about here? So he sent me a voice note the other day saying, when we're talking about ancient Egypt, what else is happening in the world? And it's a good question, actually, because you hear ancient Egypt and you're like, well, actually, what is the time period? How does it relate to Stone Ages and Bronze Ages and all that kind of thing? So enlighten Danny and enlighten all of us, Campbell.
Well, Danny, hello. This is a really good question. We get it a lot at Manchester Museum, and in the galleries of Manchester Museum, the Egypt and Sudan Gallery, we try and suggest it with dates above the cases. But it's always an issue when you're talking about the past. When are you talking about? If you talk about the Georgians, who do you mean? If you talk about the ancient Egyptians, you're talking about 3,000 years of history. So we talk about ancient Egypt between 3000 BCE, that's 5,000 years ago, and Cleopatra popping her clogs, 30 BCE, so that's 3 millennia, 3,000 years. The pyramids are at relatively near the beginning of this span, and they're probably earlier than Stonehenge. So you're talking about what archaeologists in Europe might call the Stone Age, into the Bronze Age, the Iron Age. And then along come the Romans around the time Jesus is around. So basically, you're talking about 3,000 years before then. But trying, and maybe we'll come back to this point, trying to say what the ancient Egyptians believed is tough. What did one of our ancestors believe 3,000 years ago? Probably very different to what we believe today.
It's such a huge amount of time to get your head around
Yeah.
and to even begin to think about how those beliefs might have changed, how those people might have changed, how they perceive themselves, the world around them, all of that. And we're going to unpack some of that. But first of all, I want to ask a very academic question, Campbell, which is, I have seen a popular internet meme that says that Cleopatra is closer to the iPhone than she is to the pyramids. Is that true?
Absolutely true. I've used that in my book, Brief
Well, there we
Histories
go.
Ancient Egypt,
Well
available in
plugged.
all good bookstores. Yeah, Cleopatra lives closer in time to us today. So we're in 2025. She died in 30 BCE. Than the pyramids. So the Great Pyramids are the 2600s.
Yeah.
So yeah, she
Stop
lives closer
it.
to us.
That, I need
That-
a moment to sit
Yeah.
with that. Like,
It does
yeah.
take, because it makes your brain do these kind of strange gymnastics where you're like, but that's a long time
Yeah.
since
It really
Cleopatra. So if you were Cleopatra, and we know she visited the pyramids, she knew perfectly well what the pyramids were. Indeed, she, and this is the scary thing, probably knew more about the pyramids than we do.
Yeah.
Wow. Oh, I've got
You know
chills.
what's weird as well? That when we're talking about, oh, well, we're Georgian historians or whatever, and, obviously we're generalists as well, but that was our PhD thing, whatever. Then when people are Egyptologists, they're expected to cover 3,000
Yes.
years.
Yeah.
We have like 100, 150 year thingy. So that's kind of daunting as an Egyptologist,
Yeah.
surely.
Do you get that when you say to someone, oh, I'm a historian in the broadest sense, and people say, what happened on the 25th of November, 1942? And you think,
Yeah.
that's not how being a historian works. Do people do that to you, Campbell?
Yes.
For the entire 3,000 year
It's
period.
really a problem. But as you say, even characterising what people thought about Brexit in the UK, try finding people that have exactly the same opinion.
Yes.
It's
Yeah.
tough. And we lived through that. Asking an ancient Egyptian what they thought about the building of the Great Pyramid.
Yeah.
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 is
Well,
an issue.
let's think a little bit then about that, the distance between the people themselves and how we perceive them now, how we understand that big period, and some of the assumptions that we've maybe layered onto that and
Yes.
simplified, shall we say.
Yes.
I think, when we think of ancient Egypt, obviously, there's the mummified people, there are the pyramids. We have quite a set sort of stock image in our
Yes,
minds.
Absolutely.
And I would say that the general perception, certainly my perception, is that this was quite a peaceful era. It's a very sort of aesthetic one. It's all about building things, it's about creating things. I don't necessarily think of it as being especially violent. Am I right to think that, or have I made a horrible assumption?
Oh, this is a great point to discuss. And as you both know, any point in history can be polarizing. Some people think it was great back when. Other people think it was terrible back then, back in them olden days. So I think the problem with Egypt, ancient Egypt, as an idea in people's heads, is that it tends generally to exist as a utopia. Luxury, colourful, glamorous, sunny,
Wealthy.
wealthy,
Civilized.
But then there is another angle, the opposite extreme. You have maybe influenced by scripture, the idea of the Egyptians as slave drivers for the wrong type of people.
It's true, yeah.
There's tyranny. The pharaoh is a tyrannical figure, and indeed in Arabic writing in the Middle Ages onwards, you talk about pharaoh, and that's not a compliment. You're talking about a tyrant. So I think generally, and this is partly the fault of museums and books and TV shows and exhibitions.
It's all your fault, Campbell.
Yeah, I'll take it personally. But I'm trying to unpack it myself, so I'm really glad to have the chance to talk about it here. We would rather have a simplified ancient Egypt was like this. The ancient Egyptians believed this. They had these ideals, and the darker side is ignored.
Yeah. I mean, we're going to look at some of those darker facets today, okay? And the first one I want to start with is crime and punishment. Because my perception, and tell me if I'm wrong here, but my perception is that the criminal justice system essentially is king and court, and then punishment will be met accordingly depending on what's happening there. How true is that? And what does crime and punishment look like during this entire 3,000-year period?
What was
Give us a
happening on the
snapshot.
24th June?
Yeah, well, great point. So, one problem we have generally, and we should acknowledge it, is in reconstructing ancient Egypt over the last 200 years, the length of time Egyptology has been happening, and you find this with other parts of history, we impose or layer over our perceptions of the world onto people in the past. So you see a successful civilized state like the Egyptians of the New Kingdom, so 1200 BCE, and you think, well, that must have been like the British Empire, because this is what the first interpreters, who were a lot of them British, knew. So how else could you produce these massive monuments? Oh, there must have been colonies, and they must have had viceroys, and the king must have operated as the head of a bureaucracy. You're quite right. I think in practical terms, government, that we would call government, was the king and the court, which was tiny. The elite was 1%, 2% of the people in Egypt. And the reality of crime and punishment, we know, because throughout that 3,000-year period, we have lots of evidence. Admittedly, it's spaced out, but we've got lots of evidence. And that evidence relates to face-to-face individual social situations. So you do something wrong. There's a great piece of literature, kind of popular literature, known in English as The Tale of the Eloquent Peasant. And it's about a peasant who comes a cropper because his donkey eats some of the crops of a rich man.
How dare he?
And this sets up this whole social... It's about social inequality. And where is someone going to get redress for an injustice? Well, it's not like a law court as we would understand it. It's probably a local important person who, metes out the punishment or the reward or does justice.
And there were more violent punishments as well, weren't there, for more serious crimes? I mean, justice for the donkey, but there were if you committed maybe a brutal crime, a violent crime, maybe a sexual crime, that met with more severe punishment, didn't it?
Yes, I mean, it's funny because it's true of lots of aspects of life. Things which were, to us, are very interesting, to an ancient Egyptian were par for the course. So that's just life. Someone does something bad is done to them, and it's not recorded anywhere. But there are lights shone on certain parts of society, sure, where it concerns what we would call the state. So remember, the king and the court. Killing the king, we have evidence of that, regicide. And
presumably punishment for that.
The highest, of course, punishment.
Yeah.
And so we have an extraordinary series of documents that talk about they're transcripts basically of the trial of these people who have been caught responsible for the assassination of King Ramesses III. So we're talking about the 12th century, 1100s BCE. And this is a list of the court, people very close to the king. Spoiler, it was one of his lesser wives who wanted her son to become the next king and bump the crown prince.
I would kill my husband if I was the lesser wife.
Well, if you have a perception you are the lesser wife, I'm sure there's lots of psychologizing we could do. But the culprits seem ultimately to be tried by the next king, the legitimate king, Ramesses IV, son of Ramesses III. And in these court documents, there's a whole thing about black magic. We'll maybe come back to that. And the punishment is, of course, death, because you've attempted and, in fact, succeeded in killing a god. For a long time, it was not known if Ramesses III had actually died in this harem conspiracy, it's called, this assassination attempt. But his body has been examined and his throat seems to have been cut. Enough of the flesh is preserved to show that. So not only are you, well, if you're doing well, you're allowed to commit suicide. That is merciful. If you have been executed in some fashion, probably by being put in a wooden stake until you die, and then your body is burned. So not only have you died an excruciating death, you have no chance of an afterlife because you need a body for the afterlife.
Right.
You've been utterly eviscerated.
You've been literally eviscerated, and not in a good way, in the standard elite way. After death, if someone dies a natural death, then maybe evisceration helps in the transformation of the body.
Oh, yeah.
But that's a separate thing. But in these court documents, and this is really creepy, really dark, the guilty parties' names are changed. So not even your name will survive. So you might be called Mary Ray. So Ray, the sun god, loves you. Changed to Mesjed Ray. Ray hates him.
Oh, wow.
And that's just total, complete obliteration.
Wow, that's so
Written out of
powerful.
history.
It is powerful in a society which placed for the elite a great emphasis on writing. To have your name inverted like that is really nasty.
Yeah. So, I mean, if this is what the ancient Egyptians are doing to their own people and the people under their
Yes.
rule,
Ooh,
what are
nice
they
segue.
doing to their enemies? If we're thinking about warfare in this period, obviously, you made the comparison to the British Empire. Presumably, Egypt at various points expands its borders. It is presumably coming into conflict with other people. How does it treat them?
Ooh. So, first of all, I would say there are no borders, really. The ancient Egyptians don't think quite in terms of borders. And
That's fascinating.
yeah. So our modern concept of borders on a map is non-existent. There are frontiers, and various kings talk about these frontiers, but that means if you have no borders, ancient Egypt never really tries to expand because Egypt itself is perfect. The gods favour the land of Egypt. Anywhere else is basically to be pitied or despised.
But isn't part of the concept of Egypt in their mindset? Okay.
They have the concept of Egypt as a land
Yes.
mass, but ask someone to draw a line, I think would be impossible because the borders are fuzzy. But they don't like non-Egyptians basically.
Right.
On a state level, the ideology is if you are not Egyptian, you are not good.
Follow-up question to that then. How are you identified as Egyptian? Because if Egypt is a state of mind to a certain extent and an idea that you can buy into, or who is allowed to be Egyptian and who is not?
Well, so even though on a state level, some of the earliest images of royal iconography that clearly show a king, a pharaoh, show him beating up foreign people. They are bound, they are subdued. He's bashing them over the head, doing some smiting.
Very British Empire.
Doing some
Well,
smiting.
this is what maybe the certain British colonial agents recognised in themselves. It says nothing, of course, about ancient ideas of empire. Anyway, so the state level ideology is if you're not Egyptian, if you're not living the Egyptian life. And of course, Egypt itself, then as now, is a very diverse place between Alexandria and Aswan, north and south. If you're not living in an Egyptian way, the state says you can be beaten up. But in practical terms, people move. People migrate. People change their identities. So we have evidence, written evidence, which is the best source for this, of non-Egyptians, people from the south of Egypt, what is now modern Sudan, or the Levant, for example, coming in and living in Egyptian society and being called the Syrian man or the Cushite, the Nubian woman.
And that was tolerated.
And this was, then they're merchants, they're living normal lives next to people.
Although they are othered.
But they are othered in some settings, and it's interesting, it does seem, and maybe it's not surprising given how popular ancient Egyptian imagery is today, that the way of depicting yourself as an elite Egyptian is taken on by non-Egyptian elites who move to Egypt. They don't want to show themselves as Libyan or Nubian, they want to show themselves as Egyptian.
They want to assimilate, yeah.
So that's the wealthy people, of course. But then, as you said, on the battlefield, someone who's not Egyptian is not to be pitied. There is fairly good evidence, again, from foreign names, of lists of workers on, for example, the Temple of Queen Hatshepsut. Fabulous building, 1400s BCE. We know Hatshepsut's father, Thutmose I, is a major warrior king. He's going out beating up foreigners and he's bringing prisoners of war. So you bring your prisoners of war and you say, we've got a temple needs building, and there's a list for maybe the attendance on that day, who's building today, and the list lists these non-Egyptian names. So from that you can extrapolate, actually these are probably people working under duress, under conscription or compulsion.
Now, we love an image here on After Dark,
Yes.
and in this vein, and in terms of some of the punishment that is being inflicted on some of these people, and particularly potentially in a war setting, I have a picture here of what says above it is severed penises being piled up as war trophies at Ramses III's temple. Campbell, talk to me about this, please.
So how are you going to estimate your body count?
Penises?
Yes. So there's evidence of this from a few centuries prior to that image. So Ramses III, again, 1100s BCE. Of course, Ramses III himself comes a cropper. So on the battlefield, we know a soldier in kind of hand-to-hand combat, in order to get a reward, has to, or one of the methods of getting a reward is to take a hand.
Okay.
And there is the pretty real implication. You're on the battlefield, you kill someone, and you cut off their right hand, and you present it to the troop commander and say, hey. So
And he
gruesome,
just
but
puts it in the cupboard? Like, what is he then doing with all these hands?
well, the really scary thing is, not so long ago, this idea of the hands, and as I'll come on to the penises, were just a fiction. They're just a visual way of showing how many people were killed on the battlefield and accounting for the number, until we found a pile of severed hands near a royal palace in the north of Egypt,
Wow.
in the Delta. So they seem genuinely to have been
How
doing
recent was
this.
that find?
Last 20 odd years.
Right, yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, last couple of decades.
Yeah.
So I can understand taking the hand because it's, on the one hand, evidence evidence that you have
Yes,
defeated someone, that
yes.
you've killed them.
Right hand.
And presumably it's symbolic as well.
Yes.
That they will not be able to fight, and in terms of thinking about an afterlife as well, and the desecration of a body.
Mm-hmm.
I can see where this is going, but talk to me about the escalation of hands to penises. Not a sentence I thought I'd be saying on a public podcast.
As opposed to your private podcast, your public podcast.
Available to all subscribers.
So one interpretation, Egyptological interpretation, is it's, as you've just alluded to, it's about stopping any kind of regeneration in the afterlife. Not only are you killed on the battlefield, which is pretty terrible, but you have no chance of an afterlife. Your body probably won't be buried. But to add insult to injury, your right hand is taken away and your penis is taken away, because it's men fighting on the battlefield. And so this may be an allusion to the primeval creation act, where the creator God masturbates the world into existence. So if you have no right hand and no penis, it's just a way of checking, I guess, people don't count up too many, people. So you can only have one penis, and hence the emphasis on the right hand. So you're not counting two hands.
I will
Yeah.
say this: there is no way I thought this is what I'd be discussing when I came to work today.
No, it's just...
Well, there you go.
That's
true.
the gift that ancient Egypt keeps giving.
So the image you're seeing is this kind of accountancy scene in the Temple of Ramses III.
These are not the records I sent to my accountant.
So you have hands, right hands, you have penises, and I mean, even if someone hadn't already died on the battlefield,
Oh no.
right hand and genitals are probably you're gonna bleed out. There's
Yeah,
also
that'll do it.
yeah, it's not great. But then there are also in that same on that same wall, which I was stood in front of last month.
Wow.
There are what seem to be tongues. Now, the idea that you then have that could be an allusion to creation, where there's another version of the creation myth where the creator God speaks things into existence.
And you've kind of alluded already, Campbell, to the importance of language, particularly writing, but language in the Egyptian culture and speaking things into power. Names have huge importance.
Yeah.
And sort of abusing someone's name or changing someone's name can have this real impact on them. I suppose when all the hands were found, there may very well have been penises with them, but of course there'd be no evidence of them today.
I literally thought that same thing on the train down, Maddy. I thought, well, actually, let's think about this. Yeah. It just would survive. Yeah.
Of course, it's the thing you should be thinking about on the train. Talk to me about magic. You mentioned dark magic, possible sorcery in ancient Egypt. We've got these very physical punishments going on, these physical rituals and practices on the battlefield, off the battlefield. Where does magic and magical thinking come into this?
Well, as you've just said, because those things we've just talked about have a physical representation on state temple walls, we know a bit about them. I suspect what we would call black magic was quite widespread. It just doesn't leave a material trace. So an example of this in, again, literature, we've got quite a lot of surviving, folk tales basically from ancient Egypt. There are allusions to magicians creating forms of people and animals from wax. And so if you create, for example, a wax crocodile, a crocodile could be commanded to snatch someone from the riverbank. Or if you create a wax image of someone and do something bad to the image, something bad correspondingly will happen through sympathetic magic. A basic way of thinking about it, and I'm sure it's more complicated, through sympathetic magic, something bad will happen to the person. So this relates back to what evidence we have from Egyptian fortresses, especially to the south of Egypt into Nubia. Big fortresses between maybe 1900, 1800, 1700 BCE, where the Egyptian military state, if we can call it that, is trying to control traffic on the Nile further south in Africa into what is now Sudan. And there are lots of soldiers stationed there. So there's not just an imperial presence. Of course, these have been interpreted as, colonial bastions. And of course, it's the Egyptian colonial state. I sense, rather, that there's a feeling of anxiety and fear from the local population. So you need not only to have a big set of walls and weapons and soldiers, you need to use magic against, especially in the case of to the south of Egypt, the land of Nubia, Nubian magicians appear in literature. So the Nubian people are particularly associated maybe with this threat to the Egyptians. So again, objects which you could liken to voodoo dolls. I make that advisedly.
Yeah.
But, with all the cultural context that should be borne in mind. You have images of forms, people, that have, on the really elaborate versions, text written on them with the names of all the groups that you're afraid of or you want to control, and including dead people. So there are the bad dead people that you don't want to do something to you, living people. So you enact what we call in Egyptology execration, where you do something bad to the figurine, you smash it, you break it, you burn it, you bury it, and that will effect the punishment or the repulsion on the group. Again, this was thought to be purely a magical thing that maybe just happened in object form until a decapitated body was found next to one of these deposits in one of the fortresses. So you could imagine a high pressure situation in a fortress where you catch one of the local people and you think, okay, we're going to make an example of them, and you decapitate them, and then you bury the head upside down as a magical form of supporting what you've done with objects with real people.
I don't know about you, Anthony, but when we started this conversation, we were talking at the beginning about the perceptions that we have of ancient Egypt. And for me, it's very material based. It's these tactile objects that survive, and we have incredible survivals of human bodies, of buildings, of all of that. But actually, it's this ephemeral element that's coming in now. And you're talking, Campbell, about the sort of effect that they believed in, that if you did something somewhere, it would manifest somewhere else. And whether that's naming someone, whether it's writing something on an object that is going to have an effect on a living thing, or indeed a dead thing somewhere else.
Yes, yeah.
That one act somewhere implicates a different person in a different place or a different time or a different realm. And that I'm curious about, I suppose, in your work studying this time period, is it difficult and frustrating to bridge that gap, I suppose? Because how do you access the ephemeral and the non-tangible? Because, you've mentioned so many incredible discoveries where you come across something in the archaeological record that suggests some kind of magic, but how do you fine-tune those assessments? Is that an issue in this field?
Absolutely, because we've got so little in general. I mean, loads of amazing stuff, as you just said, has survived. But think about, human occupation for 3 millennia. That produces a lot of stuff, and we only have a fraction of what was originally produced and used. So it is frustrating. The main frustration is so little has survived as an archaeological subject. But then the other frustration is some of our predecessors maybe have read that evidence in a certain way. So, for example, the ancient Egyptians were suspicious. Great builders, but they were suspicious and they worshipped animal-headed gods. And of course, it's all nonsense. And we have to fight against this default patronising attitude, which a lot of our predecessors and maybe some of our contemporary historians still have. This, to me, is a totally logical way of dealing with the world. You have a problem, you can name them, you can figure them in some way, you can connect their identity with an object, and you can do something and that affects the person. That's just a social response to life. To me, it's not a sign of, eye roll, the ancient Egyptians are actually disappointingly quite superstitious. I mean, people do it all around the world.
Yeah. So before we let you go, Campbell, I want to talk to you about probably one of the most iconic parts of ancient Egypt, and that is the pyramids. Mm-hmm. Now, we have this perception of these kind of glorious structures and this marvel, or even you'll hear some people go, aliens have built these structures. It's so unbelievable. But actually, there is quite a grim reality to the way these structures come about. Isn't that right?
Yes. So again, it's polarized. You get the people who say it was aliens, and I mean, just in the news in the last month, this story about supposed.
Yeah, I think I saw something going on. The
second pyramid of Giza, total claptrap, but especially on social media, on TikTok, Instagram, that just went wild, and you get your Graham Hancock cranks talking about that. So there's that extreme of the precision of the pyramids is preternaturally superhuman. Then there's the other, again, influenced by scripture idea. The Egyptian pharaoh was a tyrant, and of course the Egyptians were slave drivers. So the reality is, as you already alluded to in the introduction, that Egyptian people were paid, farmers, because the majority of people were farmers, to do things when they were not busy. So when the river rose every year in the inundation, the flood, for 2 or 3 months, that meant that you could more easily float blocks from a quarry on the opposite side of the river to the site of the pyramid. And again, 20 years ago, you could have spoken to an Egyptologist who said, well, we'll never find the diary of a pyramid builder. We did. A papyrus on the Red Sea coast has an account log book of this is how we moved the blocks.
Oh.
And the guy was called Merer, who was in charge of this. So amazing discoveries.
I didn't even know that existed.
And that's so amazing to think this is contemporary with Stonehenge, right? And of course, how they moved those stones is endless debate around that and where they came from and how they got to the Salisbury Plain, etc. And like the fact that we can point to this in ancient Egypt and say, this
Yeah.
is what they were doing.
So there were people, and again, there is no social background really to them, so there's not the information a historian might want. But so you've got to kind of nuance this idea of everyone was happy and joyful and were really happy to be part of this project. In a sense, from the evidence we have, it seems that the great success of the pyramids was not just the building the pyramid, but to gather people apparently from all over Egypt to work on a national project. There'd be an ongoing crew of people, no doubt, working in the pyramids year round, but there would be an increase in a concentration at the time of the flood, which incidentally is when it's hottest. So the majority of work was done in the Egyptian summer, which is not great. Anyway, so I could imagine, being a farmer from the south of Egypt, working for 3 months, being put up, being fed, having access to medical care, going back home with a feeling of pride, being like, wow, I helped work and I saw these incredible things, and wow, the north of Egypt is totally different. All of that.
Being paid, do we know, or we don't know?
Paid in kind, so paid with rations.
Sure.
It was a non-monetary
Sure.
economy. But you're given shelter, you're given food. But even though we have some lovely suggestive bits of evidence like graffiti on some of the blocks in the pyramids, which have the names of the gangs that were responsible for the block dragging. So you have names like the Friends of Khufu.
Yeah, there's like nicknames and stuff, aren't there? Yeah.
Or the Drunkards of Menkaure. I love that
I want to be in that team.
You're like, it sounds like quite
No, you
good.
don't. You want to build a pyramid with a hangover. That sounds like the
In the
worst.
heat as well. That's true.
Not good. But so there's this idea that it was great, but the reality, as your introduction suggested, must have been not great. Yeah. It is not easy to build a pyramid. So we don't have any direct evidence of this from the site of Giza, really. The cemetery that is sometimes said to be the cemetery of the workers probably relates to people who were servicing the cult of the pharaoh after his death, so after the pyramid was finished. So it's difficult to say what the work people were like. They probably went back home after their shift, or if they died at the time, they were sent back home. However, we have some, again, quite sinister evidence from the site of Amarna. So this is the town in Middle Egypt where Tutankhamun grew up. And at that time, the king at the time, Tutankhamun's father, probably Akhenaten, says, right, we need a new, completely from scratch city. We don't have time to drag big blocks. We need to use small blocks, enough that one person can carry. Now, this is something that really shows us that it's better to have a team of people drag a big block than to have individual people carry a single block.
Yes.
Because we have the people's bodies and they are young and their backs have literally been broken from the effort of carrying the blocks. And a kind of a sinister aspect of this is in the wall scenes. You see common mortals in the tomb scenes of the elite are all shown bending at the waist. And you do kind of wonder, is that maybe because they have literally been cowed by the work of doing whatever they've had to do to make this amazing city appear in 20 years. So no, we don't have evidence directly from Giza, from the sites of the Great Pyramids, but I don't think it would have been a party.
Yeah, no, far from it.
Would have been better if it was aliens, I think. Better for people.
Well,
Would it?
The ancient Egyptians, very clever people, but it's neither, hell on earth nor in utopia. It's somewhere in between, because that's human society.
Yeah.
Some
people get more power and they use that power in different ways.
As a final question then, just thinking about the sacrifice that these people made in building the pyramids and the damage that was done to them, and thinking about the wider conversation that we've had and this idea of effect and sort of magical thinking, what is in it for these people building these huge monuments? What do they believe that is allowing them to wake up every day and do that and be broken in that way?
I mean, again, it comes back to this: to what extent are we using colonial imagery and putting that back on to the ancient Egyptians. So evidence which could be interpreted as corvée labour, where you get a work gang together. Did that exist? To what extent did that exist? Egyptologists are still not quite sure. But even if it didn't exist, even if some hard conscription didn't exist and people were willingly doing it, what are they getting for it other than a sense of pride? As I maybe alluded to before, I suspect if it were me, and if you were successfully going back home to your family and saying, guess what I've been up to, there must have been not just a sense of pride, just human pride, and wow, I did this thing and I've seen more of the world. There may have been a thought of, I have materially contributed to a monument which is conventionally interpreted as the tomb of the king, whether it actually is the tomb of the king. It's some kind
Future
of
episode.
perhaps it's some kind of incredible religious royal structure. Whether the king was buried there or not, whether it was a tomb or not, doesn't matter. The fact that you physically touched and helped put those blocks in place, going from all the other evidence we know from pharaonic Egypt, where materials, association, physical proximity to gods is important. For centuries, for millennia after the Great Pyramid, State Pyramid were built, people were jostling to get buried in the shadow of those monuments. You're not telling me if you had actively had a hand in building them, some metaphysical benefit came to you. I'm sure that was the case.
I suppose one of the things that's really struck me about this conversation, which has been so enlightening in a way, is the extent to which Egyptologists are constantly unraveling some of this data that is, and changing the interpretation of that data that's coming through. And I think that makes it it almost to an extent explains why it's so enduring as a subject area, where we think it's this 20 years later, actually, oh no, we think it might be this now.
Else.
And it is that thing that feeds back into what you were talking about earlier, Maddy, about like codes, because in a way they have left us so many codes and we think we understand, and then we go, oh no, I'm not quite sure I did understand that correctly. Let's rephrase that and look at the code again. So that's potentially one of the reasons, along with loads of other things, that it's so enduring, and it is such an enduring subject.
There are definitely people, and maybe this is the subject for another episode, who I like to say they're playing a game with monuments and signs and codes. And one of the things that I think Egyptologists find most satisfying is feeling like you work out the code of the game.
Yeah.
And sure, there's a fraction of things preserved, and we look at things still generally with a very modern Western view. But even amongst all that misunderstanding and lack of evidence, to feel like you are communicating or get some point that the ancient Egyptians were trying to make to us, that is so, so rewarding. Yeah, great to be an Egyptologist.
Yeah.
I think that's the perfect place to end. I know I might retrain now.
Yeah. Although I couldn't take the heat.
You'd be terrible.
Yeah,
That was quite hot.
I'll have to.
I
just
would
stay
enjoy
where I am.
it. I couldn't go and work anywhere cold. I couldn't be a historian of any cold place.
Historian of the cold. I want to know somebody who's a historian of the cold. I know that's not what you said, but I wasn't listening.
Become that person. Live the dream.
That's me.
If you enjoyed this episode, you can leave us a 5-star review wherever you get your podcasts. If you're watching on YouTube, then please like and subscribe. Spread the word. It helps people to discover our show. And if you want to get in touch to talk about this episode or any other, you can email us at afterdark@historyhit.com.